what felt like 5 very short weeks, we've finally reached the final 2 episodes of Fionna and Cake. And if you've been anywhere near the internet since very early Thursday morning, you know that people certainly have some opinions on this pair of episodes. So, for the final time for quite some time, let's dive into the new Adventure Time we got last week and discuss what doesn't work in this finale and what ultimately really does.
My name is Simon Petrikov. I'm from another world, far different than your own.
The first few minutes of this episode consists of some really terrific scenes, starting with the somewhat cold open, which is notably not before the title card, as we see a shared nightmare between Fionna and Cake. Besides this scene, just like the rest of the finale, looking absolutely beautiful from start to finish, the episode also takes advantage of the fact that it is conceivable that their world would become temporarily magic, as Simon could have temporarily become the Ice Gang, so it's not entirely immediately obvious that this isn't reality. I appreciate them giving us a chance to see Hunter Wizard's design here, as we never get another opportunity, as the episode dips into the nightmare part of this illusion, as we see horrific interpretations of Prince Gumball and Vampire Marshall Lee, as Fionna begins to worry once again about the implications of involuntarily making people magical again. The most visually striking part of this sequence comes as the pair make it to their home, as Fionna eerily opens her fridge, building tension before the reveal of a horrifically unsettling depiction of Ice Simon, which fully plants the seed of guilt into Fionna's mind. Anyway, once they get up and have a quick interaction with Tiffany on the ice, Fionna finally learns about her 2 closest friends being together. And while I do think that this scene could have been a bit longer, it's still a cute reveal as she revels in the moment. Anyway, as Gary and Marshall learn and come to terms with the whole we're all in some old guy's head and Cake is magic and soon everybody else will be too thing, we get to see what's going on with the rest of that old guy's body in what easily becomes the best scene in this half of the finale. As Simon slowly learns exactly where he is, first seeing the Lich in a return that I honestly wasn't sure was actually coming, but was heavily appreciated. Seeing Adventure Time's most iconic true villain on his knees talking about losing his one and only purpose is initially such an odd scene, but that train of thought is ended by the reveal of who we all knew was coming, the one and only Gold Betty. And man, is every single shot of this character throughout all 44 minutes absolutely terrific at showing the true horror of the character's condition, with the character movements feeling deeply uncomfortable as she stares down Simon and the Lich. Of course, watching the only successful Lich in the series, and the one responsible for the death of at least some version of every single character we loved in the first 4 seasons, being completely demolished by her also further entrenches the idea that Gold Betty has truly become powerful beyond recognition, as the Lich's final state implies that he isn't the first Scholar of Gold to get this treatment. In general, I really like how the Lich is used in this episode, as by making him less mechanical, they highlight how truly visually emotionless Betty has become. Despite this, we get a really heartfelt conversation between the god and her former fiance at this point, which is obviously just Simon talking, as he apologizes for what he did to Betty, telling her about how meeting Fionna and Cake has finally given him purpose for living again, as he prepares to lay down his life for them just like Betty did for him. It's such a fantastic scene that I loved so much, and this is where the finale first starts to dip for a bit, as Betty interrupts him as we jump thousands of years into the future to meet back up with Shermie and Beth, who continue their come along with me tradition of crashing Adventure Time finales, as we see them pull Finn and Jake style shenanigans in the Gibbon-ruled Pup Kingdom. And while I really liked how they were used to reinforce the themes of Adventure Time's first ending, and I've always been on board with the idea of them getting the next Adventure Time spinoff, them being in such a huge chunk of this finale that feels kind of rushed at parts otherwise, in such a way that honestly feels like a backdoor pilot, is tough to stomach. Anyway, to quickly go through the rest of the plot for the episode, Gold Betty ultimately sends Simon's mind into the body of Shermie, who first freaks out, with some great voice acting I might add, and then goes with Beth, who thinks he's just joking around, to a library to try and find some information on the crown. And even if you want to argue that Simon becoming Shermie is symbolic for reasons I'll get to later in this video, that doesn't make the large chunk of this episode about Simon stuck in Shermie's body, robbing a library, and fighting pagelings with Beth any less boring and out of place in a finale like this. As I mentioned at the top, this episode features title cards done in the style of the original show, something that is reflected in the Simon, Shermie, and Beth shenanigans, feeling like a regular, somewhat low-stakes episode of the base Adventure Time. Once the pair get back to the reading tree, there are suddenly a few more things that I really like. As Shermie Simon crying at the thought of not being able to save Fionna and Cake is a really nice moment that's only slightly hurt by the goofiness of the situation. Their plot ends with the pair finally getting into the book that Shermie found about the crown, only for it to reveal itself to be a cross between a choose-your-own-adventure book and a PS1 style game about the titular Casper and Nova, who reveal themselves to be metaphorical representations of Simon and Betty rather quickly and rather obviously. Something that really works for this episode, as the Animal Crossing N64 type graphics are really charming. This idea does start to lose its charm in the second half of this pairing, but first we gotta break down what's going on in Fionna world. Once we catch back up to them, Marshall and Gary seem to have gotten over the initial shock of the new and improved Cake, and are instead focused on the idea of them possibly forgetting about each other once the magic hits. A reality that Fionna is unable to confirm, deny, or even stomach. Meanwhile, Cake seems more or less indifferent to their struggle, making jokes about how they might end up trying to kill each other like in Vampire World, a moment that more or less confirms that Fionna will be the only one on this side of the portal to get any character development or any kind of arc in these two episodes, as she continues to worry that she's messing everything up. Despite all of my somewhat negativity for especially this half of the finale, I really like Fionna in pretty much all 44 minutes of this thing, as she remains the solid character that the first 8 episodes built her up to be, as hearing of Marshall and Gary's plight causes her to want to go try and find a portal to try and fix what she thinks she caused. Meanwhile, Scarab, who I'm sure you didn't forget is the actual antagonist of the show, tries to take out Simon while he's in his current state, only for Gold Betty to not exactly take that well, splitting him into smaller and smaller bugs until they are eventually forced to flee, piece by piece, into the Simon portal, as the animation of an angry Gold is genuinely perfect in showcasing the alien feel of the god as she looks down and protects the incomparably small Simon in front of her. Because of these events, when Fionna opens up the freezer for access to the portal, she instead finds a collection of scarab beetles who threaten to combine back into their somewhat menacing source, as the gang spend the rest of the episode trying to secure them all. I really like the chemistry between Fionna, Cake, Marshall, Gary, and Hunter throughout these scenes, as they feel like a gang who's at least had a few episodes together, even though some of them have never actually met each other before this point. I like a lot of the animation they use during these scenes with all of the various methods to trap the little scarabs, and the scene back in Fiona's bedroom where they watch Cheers and talk about how screwed and helpless they are is really nice too. LSP being the one to free the scarab beetles and ultimately risk the fate of their world truly makes it feel like Lumpy Space Princess is there herself. And Scarab appearing from behind the flames in the apartment is genuinely the sickest and most imposing the character has been or will be at any point throughout this series, as the first half comes to a close. Since this episode connects very heavily to the second part, I'm going to save my overall thoughts for the end and move into the half of the finale that doesn't mention Cheers and yet has the sitcom as its namesake.
You were a wonderful experience.
You were everything.
The first time I watched this finale, sleep deprived at 3 a.m., I really didn't like it, and every time I thought about it or watched a chunk of it again, I just kept finding things to dislike. But as I watched it one final time to prepare to write this review, and really tried to understand what they were going for, I think I finally got it. So just in case you're wondering why this review is mostly positive, when the first half of this video kinda made it sound like it wasn't going to, that's why. Anyway, despite my somewhat critical reevaluation of this episode mid-video, no amount of soul searching is going to make this beautifully animated cold open of Casper and Nova that continues throughout various long scenes anything but boring and overly handholdy. From like a minute into their appearance in the last episode, it becomes clear that they are a representation of the idea that Betty and Simon's relationship wasn't perfect, on the basis that Betty was constantly making sacrifices that Simon was woefully unaware of. Despite this, and the fact that the idea has been touched on both in the original series, like in Temple of Mars, and in Fionna and Cake back in Jerry, this episode still feels the need to beat this idea into us, as it's made clearer and more obvious over and over and over again. And I don't want to give the idea that I dislike this direction for the plot, as I'm going to praise it extensively in like a paragraph and a half, but in a show meant for adults, this plot point still could have been more subtle. Also, while there are a few good jokes in here, I still think that, while a neat appearance, Beth and Shermie just didn't need to be in this episode, as it really only comes into play when Beth assumes that Jeremy doesn't understand the intricacies of Casper and Nova's or Betty and Simon's relationship because he's a child, when it's really because Simon views his past romance with childlike innocence instead of how it truly was. And yeah, this point is really cool, and when it clicked in my head, I was immediately impressed with how the show weaved that in, but it still wasn't worth all of this screen time, even with the inclusion of the fantastically named Pond Swan. At this point, Shermie and Beth say goodbye until their likely inevitable spinoff as we get back to Fionna World, where the Scarab is certainly scarabing it up. And if you've watched any of my Fionna and Cake reviews, you can probably guess how I feel about Scarab in this episode. It's not great. He becomes such a goofy villain that he's impossible to take seriously. And while I wish there was some kind of thematic link between him and Fionna, like between the Collector and Luce in the Owl House finale, there's just not. Still, while I don't exactly like the Scarab in this one, I like a lot of the stuff happening around him. The visuals with him destroying the town are great. Cake turning into Godzilla is such a fun way for her to contribute to the fight, and the jokes throughout, while perhaps a bit overkill, are always funny. Especially with Gary and Marshall trying to use baked goods and songs respectively, and how that ultimately goes. So yeah, while the Scarab isn't my favorite in this episode, as he lets down as a villain pretty consistently, especially with the dumb scene with everybody coming out of the eggs and revealing that he trapped them for petty reasons, I still think this scene is pretty good, and sets up two scenes that I initially disliked, but ultimately found myself really appreciating the third time around. As Simon returns to his own body, he begins to have a conversation with Gold Betty that's not easy on the heartstrings, as he starts to ponder back to that day at the bus stop and what steps he could have taken differently. And while this video was originally going to feature me going on and on about how dumb it is for Simon to talk about what he could have done to not find the crown, when we literally saw how much everything sucked in the vampire world without an Ice King, that's not the point of this scene. Simon realizing that his relationship wasn't perfect isn't the point of the scene either. Throughout the entirety of the season, it's clear that Simon was going to have to value his own life at some point in the show, as he comes to the conclusion to not put on the crown. And while the show could have had him come to this conclusion in a dozen different ways, the way it chooses to do this is by Betty pointing out to Simon that while he loved her and she loved him, and he appreciated her, he never fully understood and therefore appreciated the depths of the sacrifices she constantly made for him, with the ultimate one being her becoming Gold Betty to save him and his mind. Simon going back in the flashback and trying to change this event isn't really about him wishing that he went on her expedition, it's about him wishing that he had just approached their relationship differently in general. And by suddenly reevaluating Betty's biggest sacrifice, Simon realizes how much she truly valued his life, and how awful it would be towards her past if he threw it all away and just put on the crown again anyway. But really, that's only part of why this works so well, as the true reason that Simon didn't value his own life in the first place is because he couldn't stop thinking about all of his mistakes in the past. He just couldn't find acceptance for what had happened and what he did in response, fueling both his self-hatred and his willingness to give up his ability to think about the past and become the Ice King once again. But what Betty helps him do, even in her incomprehensible god state, is allow him to begin moving on from the past, symbolized through the flashback fading away, Simon throwing the crown into the abyss, and ultimately the separation of Fionna World, a representation of the Ice King's mania as he moves on to focus on the future. It definitely took me multiple rewatches of the scene to fully grasp and appreciate everything that it goes for, but as I just spent a few minutes talking about, I really love how they chose to wrap up Betty and Simon's story, as he learns to appreciate his life and Betty's sacrifices, and to stop obsessing over the unchangeable past. Assuming that we never get another story so focused on these two characters, I'm glad we got one final goodbye, as Simon sees one last glimpse of his love, as she seemingly morphs into something we may never see the full consequences of. And after a casual canonization of Water Park Prank, Simon is left in a field to break down everything that just happened. Meanwhile, Fionna receives two different phone calls from Simon while she's dealing with the chaos of her namesake world. And as Simon chaotically offers one final time to become the Ice King and save their world in the middle of everything I just talked about, Fionna declines, finally accepting her world as the way it is and mirroring Simon's journey towards acceptance as well. And what better way to represent this change in mindset than Simon taking the now separated Fionna world and giving it to her in the form of a dandelion, as just like in the first episode, she once again wishes for her world to change. And although this time is silent, it's more than clear what she desires. It's a really beautiful end to the series, as Fionna accepts her world for what it is and decides that she needs to take partial ownership of it if she wants it to become better. And there's still 10 minutes left. Since I've spent a few minutes being positive at this point, it's time for me to be negative again, as everything in Fionna World after this point ranges from okay to some of the most puzzling decisions that Adventure Time has ever made. At this point, Scarab's rampage is stopped by a comedic phone dropping in from the boss, who tells him that his powers no longer work to destroy the world, as Fionna World has become canonized. A nice callback to the fanfiction nature of Fionna and Cake. In response to this news, Scarab literally decides to throw a temper tantrum that's stopped by Prismo summoning Baby Finn and Pep Tank from Fionna World, the squirrel from Ooh, and just as I somewhat predicted, Little Destiny and Jay, from what I'm currently calling my favorite episode of the series, but that's in jeopardy after the pair make the mind-numbing decision to just stay in Fionna World after this fight. I'm getting ahead of myself a little, but it just bothers bothers me so much to see Jay willingly leave his world in good spirits and making jokes about toilets when he has recently orphaned little siblings back at home. I just can't believe this plot point made it past so many writers, and is by far the least excusable aspect of the finale. Even if Farmworld Finn is still alive because of his hat made for vampires or whatever, this moment is still so awkward and just left such a sour taste in my mouth. Fionna turning giant with the squirrel strawberries in her biggest fantasy is a fun moment in this painfully unnecessary scene. And while I do like her getting to defeat the scarab herself after Gold Betty was really the one who saved her world, her acceptance of not being magic, followed by her growing huge with magic, doesn't exactly quite fit thematically. Anyway, I just don't really think this big action scene helps the finale more than it ultimately lets it down, as I would have loved the soft, dialogue-centric ending that it looked like we were going to get. But ultimately, just like Simon and Fionna learn in this episode, all you can do is accept the unchangeable past that the last third or so of this episode could definitely be better. And with that, the only thing left to discuss is the ending montage, which, and I really mean no disrespect to the artist or the people who made the decision to use their song, just does not feel like Adventure Time music. Seriously, so many options here could have been better, as they literally could have just used the extended Everything in You or the Cheers theme, or just something else that actually sounds like Adventure Time, but instead we get a song that they couldn't even be bothered to put on the soundtrack. Anyway, enough about that. I do mostly like what's actually happening in this montage, as we get a variety of hilarious circumstances of the newly hodgepodge reality of Fionna World, with the best scene here having to be Fionna and Marshall protesting for better rent, as the Fionna World equivalent of the Lord of the Underworld being a landlord is never not going to be funny. We also get some Simon stuff here, and while I do think there are a million other scenes I would have ended with than him going to therapy as a literal joke, Simon embracing Astrid as well as future technology is a nice touch. Also, we see what ultimately happens with the Scarab, as he becomes 2D just like Prismo, which is a goofy punishment for the goofy character they wrote him into. Moving on to something more positive, the final scene of the season, and probably Fionna and Cake as a series, is such a beautifully animated scene that I had no choice but to use it as the thumbnail, as she continues to appreciate her world the way that it is, instead of how it was when Simon was the Ice King. In general, while I'll have more to say about the finale in about 2 weeks when I do my season overview, I think these episodes are best viewed when you don't focus on what's not in the episode. When I describe a Fionna and Cake finale that has no Marceline and Simon, no Huntress Wizard, doesn't reveal Prismo's boss, doesn't utilize the fact that Fionna and Cake were infecting the world and making things non-magic, and lacks the big gut punch of a moment that other finales of Adventure Time have had, you can convince yourself that this finale sucks. But when I describe a finale that is impeccably well animated, really funny, has complex and cleverly implemented themes, features Simon coming face to face with Gold Betty and coming out of that experience understanding their relationship better and appreciating his own life as a result, and a finale that wraps up and ties together Fionna and Simon's arc to the theme of acceptance in a way that took me multiple viewings to properly understand, and you have a finale that ultimately feels like nothing else in animation, and thus will always be received very differently by different people who were lucky enough to watch this series. Anyway, that's about it for me. Thank you so much to anybody who's come along with me on this fantastic journey with Fionna and Cake throughout September, as it was the biggest month ever for Ample in both content produced and viewership, a fact for which I am deeply grateful. As I mentioned before, after I take a brief detour to Jump City for the first video of October, I still have one more wrap-up video for Fionna and Cake planned, where I'm going to rank rank the episodes, rank the songs, and just kind of generally talk about my thoughts on the show as a whole. So if you have anything else you want me to mention in that video, leave it down in the comments. Either way, this has been AmpleSamuel, and going through Fionna and Cake with you guys is truly an experience I won't soon forget. Thanks for watching.